Dr. Horton's message was incredibly unique, incredibly powerful. The one this afternoon, all of his drone pictures, nobody is doing that. ICR's not doing it. AIG's not doing it. CMI's not doing it. No, what's that sonar? Does everybody hear that pinging? Anyway, nobody is doing that. And Dr. Horton's work is really, really powerful. I mean, it was a blessing for you to get to see this. At major conferences, nobody is seeing that. And for him to get those pictures of definitive stuff that happened after the Missoula Lake flood, and to be able to extrapolate that on a continental wide scale is very, very powerful, very powerful. And he'll be working with ICR in producing a book on all of this. And we had one proviso for us to publish his book is that he had to write it. And so, you have to produce the book. And when you produce the book, we'll get Dr. Clary and others, and we'll review it, and we'll make sure that it's technically sound, that we're not saying anything. Dr. Horton, I am talking about your wonderful work here on all of this. And we were going to publish that book. It is unique. And all of that to say, you don't have to be a professional geologist. You don't have to be a professional biologist in order to do significant and powerful things for creation science. There is a role for the citizen scientist, and I know Dr. Horton has his degree in veterinary medicine, but his big contribution right now is here in geology. So ask the Lord to give you a project, to give you something to work on, to give you an area to make a contribution in any way. It may be doing research, it may not be on that, but it's very, very important along those lines. What is that sonar? Am I hearing that pinging? Who's doing that? Back. I don't want anybody zeroing in on us and blowing us up on these ways. That's what it sounds like, this pinging. Okay, so very quickly, all that to say is I shortened my talk a little bit because I wanted to make sure Dr. Horton had every opportunity to get everything in, and I wasn't worried. Every time he was saying, we're running out of time, but I've got to show you this. We're running out of time, but I've got to show you this. I'm thinking, I'll just cut a couple slides here and we'll get through all of these things. This slide, the title is important. Why do they happen? Why do these blunders happen? And I have a book in the back, I'll show a picture of it here on my slide, on 20 major evolutionary blunders, and we could have actually gone on longer. We're not here to just point out that evolutionists make mistakes. We want to know first and foremost, why do they make these mistakes? Why are these happening? But then second, they're not benign. These blunders are not just, okay, I was wrong. They actually do affect the people's lives, and they affect thousands of people's lives. So it's important that we kind of pick this out. And I discussed all of these, as Dr. Cleary has mentioned, in our free monthly magazine, Acts and Facts. So for the last time for today, if you haven't signed up for that baby in the back, sign up for that. And you'll actually be able to get most of the articles that we cover in this book. And I see it in the back there. So just sit back, listen, and you'll be able to get all of the information from the book here. But what we're going to do right now is have a friendly conversation with all of these men here. And those of you who have been following creation science recognize them. You see Charles Darwin right in the middle. You see your good bud Richard Dawkins is still alive there. Kenneth Miller, Jerry Coyne. You see all of these people who are leaders in the field. They are influencing the way people think. And they're influencing them the way they think on how they see the world. They see it in ways that are very different than us. So what does it mean to just see something? And I'm going to kind of give them an out. I'm going to say they really do, in their mind, see things. So you see a little data stream there. That's not from a human being, it's from a cat. And it's from only a few neurons in the visual cortex for just about 10 seconds. And you can see just off a couple neurons, your brain, a cat's brain, is collecting a tremendous amount of data. And nobody knows exactly how vision takes place, but there is a matching process. And whether matching actually takes place in your brain, nobody knows. Whether the matching actually takes place in your mind, nobody knows. There's a big dispute in the neurological realm where things are even stored in your brain, or whether your brain actually stores things altogether or not. But we do know that there's a matching process. There's a matching process where data is being gathered by your eye. So you are not seeing in your eyes right now. You have the perception that you're looking at me and you're seeing in your eyes, but you're not. You're actually seeing me at the back of your skull, way back here. So if you put your hand where your neck is attaching to your skull, that part of your brain back here is where you are seeing me right now. Your eyes are just collecting data in tremendous amounts, and then that data is being processed, and somehow it is matched, and it's matched with memories. It's memories that you're taught from your earliest childhood, many of them by your mom and your dad. And kids are always asking questions, what's this, what's this, what's this? And so you start to store these things, and that's why you don't have memories of when you're 1 year old, because there's nothing to connect it to. There's no data to match up. So in your brain, you are able to see things. So right now, you have stored a memory of a man moving his arms. That's in your memory there. So the data is coming in your eyes. You see that and is matching. Here's a man moving his arms. Here is a young, virile man moving his arms in this way. And you match that pattern in your mind. Now, you're supposed to laugh at my jokes. That wasn't a joke. That was bringing this in. So you match these things. And you don't even have to actually take in data through your eyes. In fact, I could say, close your eyes right now. Everybody, close your eyes. Now, what do you see when I say these words? A, what's up, Doc? What do you see? You see Bugs Bunny. What color is he? What's he got in his hand? See? You see it. And that is how many of you actually saw Bugs Bunny? Of course you did. You saw it in your mind. You saw Bugs Bunny. And that's how you get programmed. The trouble is, seeing is matching data, and the patterns that you see can be true patterns. They can be phony patterns. They can be faulty patterns. They can even be phantom patterns. And we covered a couple of those. The true patterns, a man moving his arm, the ultra true pattern, the virile man, and the phantom pattern of Bugs Bunny. Why is this important? Because evolutionary theory has a major weakness to it, in my opinion. It's not ever discussed as a weakness, but it is a weakness. And Stephen Jay Gould, and I'm putting these quotes in. I actually usually have them out of the talk, but I wanted to put them in today because this afternoon you come across as like creationist aficionados. So we'll go a little bit deeper here. Stephen Jay Gould, probably the world's leading researcher at the time and the world's leading theorist for evolutionary theory. He wrote this massive book, Structure of Evolutionary Theory. And in it, he discusses major components of their theory. And one of them was extrapolation, or he called it extrapolationism, and he referred to it other times as scope. And he said this: researchers use, quote, history from data of an imperfect record that cannot, in any case, see past causes directly, but can only draw conclusions from preserved results of these causes by explaining, quote, large-scale results by extrapolation from short-term processes. In other words, he's admitting nobody can see what happened in the past. Nobody even really knows exactly what happened in the past, but we do know what's happening in the present. And when what we can see in the present, we can extrapolate backwards to time in the past. And what he's calling extrapolation, I would call by a completely different word. imagination. Imagination. Now, imagination, he doesn't use it because it sounds so unscientific, and it is. And I'm going to suggest that the further you have to think in the millions of years in the past, the more imagination you must muster up and invoke. So the further you go in the past, you actually have to use this imagination. So who readily admits that you have to use imagination? Well, this man here did, Richard Dawkins, the world's leading advocate for evolution today, in my opinion. And he said this in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. It took a very large leap of what? Imagination for Darwin and Wallace to see that, contrary to all intuition, there is another way, and once you have understood it, a far more plausible way for complex design to arise out of primeval simplicity. A leap of the imagination so large that to this day many people seem still unwilling to make it. Well, praise the Lord for that. You know, it is contrary to intuition. But a couple of comments on his thought. One, he's saying that you need this imagination. And two, what is he saying you need to imagine? He's telling you what evolutionary theory was here to explain, and it goes back to what I mentioned in my first talk this morning. The very first thing and the most important thing that evolutionary theory must explain is, why do creatures look so incredibly designed? It is the design of creatures which is the natural revelation of God to humanity. You see and you understand things about God by looking at his creatures. Darwin changed the way he saw creatures, and therefore he changed the way people saw God. And so evolutionary theory is to explain this. Why is there such complex design? And he said it took a leap of imagination. And he said it took a leap of imagination so that you would see the world in a different way. You would actually look at things and you would see them literally in your mind's eye differently from that point on. Jerry Coyne, another vociferous evolutionist, he's also still alive. He's a retired professor at the University of Chicago. He went on to argue to say it is not valid, however, to assume that because one man cannot imagine such pathways, these are evolutionary pathways, they could not have existed. And he's pushing back against people like me who would say, boy, you're pushing me to accept something which is so counterintuitive and which is so contrary to human experience, I can't imagine how it would happen. His response is, oh, you can't imagine it, but it's invalid for you to say it couldn't have happened. That's your argument? And not only does Jerry Coyne say it, but the theistic evolutionist Kenneth Miller says essentially the same thing. Anyone such as me, can state at any time that he or she cannot imagine how evolutionary mechanisms might have produced a certain species, organ, or structure. Such statements obviously are personal, and they say more about the limitations of those who make them, i.e. me, than they do about the limitations of Darwinian mechanisms. But on the other hand, imagining them doesn't make Darwinian mechanisms any more real either. So I put all of these quotes in because most people don't recognize this, that evolutionists readily admit that they need large, copious doses of imagination in order to get their theory to work right, even in their own mind. Because there are major gaps in the fossil record. They imagine ghost lineages. They imagine all kinds of things. The trouble with imagination, though, it's just a mental sensation. And it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to any reality or inbound data or learned things or even experience. Now, on the one hand, that can be good. I mean, if I'm an engineer and I'm tasked to design something and nobody has ever designed anything like it in the past, imagination can be a good thing. It allows me to mentally project, well, maybe we could do it this way, or maybe you could do it this way. It's all going to have to go by engineering principles, but you can imagine ways to build things. You can imagine stuff that's never happened before. Imagination is an incredible gift. Every one of us in this room uses it. If I were to ask for a show of hands, how many in this room have imagined what heaven will be like? Every hand would go up. We all, I think it's going to be like this. My way is probably right, but you can imagine your ways on that. There. So imagination can be a good thing, but imagination can also be bad. It can lead you astray. So imagination, boom, taking notes. Point number 1. This is the take-home message from today's message. Imagination is the fundamental problem which leads to blunders. Imagination is the fundamental problem which leads to evolutionary blunders. They make them because they see things and they see them over and over again. So let's take a look at Piltdown Man. Piltdown Man, obviously everybody knows it's a forgery. Everybody knows it's a fake. We're not here to kick evolutionists, say, you made another mistake here. It's to learn from it. Why in the world did we have this Piltdown Man? So I went all the way back to the original paper, which was published in the leading scientific journal of the United States of America, Science, in 1913. And this is what they said, publishing on this finding. A discovery, speaking of the Piltdown Man, of the greatest importance. Now remember, this is in the scientific journal. The nearest approach we have yet reached to a missing link, probably few will deny that Eanthropus, that is early man Dawsoni, it was named after a man named Dawson, Charles Dawson, is almost, if not quite as much human as simian. So they're looking at this and they're saying, wow, I'm looking at these bone fragments and they look human, but they also look simian. And here are the bone fragments that they were looking at that Dawson had provided for everybody. They're old because they're dark and they're reddish brown and everything like this. And they look kind of simian and they look kind of human. That's, why? Because he has a human brain case and he has the jawbone of an ape. Well, no wonder they looked like they were human and they looked like they were simian. We now know from retrospect that they were bones from these fake things. And now that you look at them, they really do look kind of fake. I mean, look how uniformly stained they are. They're uniformly stained. Anybody should have been thinking of this. But remember, I said that these were fake fossils. So imagination must triumph. And as Mike Mueller said yesterday, Piltdown Man was used as evidence in the Scopes monkey trial, was entered into evidence as evidence for evolution, and it was a total fraud. It was a total fake. Well, did you need imagination? Well, of course you did, because from these bony fragments, this is what Eanthropus looked like. You see a little bit of imagination between that and that? So imagination fills in all of these blanks. But here's where the story gets interesting. It is a human skull cap. And if you were to read the rest of that science paper that I just showed you, you would read a scientific discussion as these scientists looking at this, which they didn't know was a human skull cap, they were finding all of these features of an ape as they looked at it. Question number 1, are they just lying? Are they liars? Are they just pathological liars who do this? Or is their belief in evolutionary theory so strong that when they see something, they actually see what they're looking for in their mind's eye? They see it. And then the rest of the article went on to describe, as they were looking at a jawbone of a real ape, why they saw human-like features in that. So I'm suggesting that when they see these things in their mind, they actually see them. They believe it, and they see those kinds of things. I'll give you a couple other examples that show that. Well, anyway, that hoax went on for quite some time, and in 1954, it was retracted. It was retracted in science, but it went from 1913 until 1954 when you had the great Piltdown hoax finally exposed in the scientific literature. And in 1915, just a few years after the Piltdown thing was discovered, this famous painting was made of, if you knew the people at the time, you'd recognize their faces in it, of the world's leading researchers as they're studying this skull and they're seeing all of these features. And the New York Times went on to report in 1990, the skull and the study of this eventually brought knighthood to its 3 leading expositors. You don't think you can't get fame by trafficking in the evolution industry? You better believe it's an industry, you better believe it's a moneymaker, and you better believe it's a way to fast fame. And these men were on the track to fast fame, so much so that they got knighthoods. These learned gentlemen were honored after having spent many years and many pages discoursing on the very human features they discerned in Piltdown Man's ape-like jaw and the very ape-like features they found in his human cranium. The Piltdown skull illustrates the ever-present danger for scientists of seeing exactly what they expect to see. Why are they a setup for that? Because their theory has a fundamental flaw in that it requires huge doses of imagination, and they will never be able to get past that flaw because they cannot see into the past. And so it is this imagination which set them up for this flaw. Well, that was 1954 when they discovered it. Would anybody repeat that again today? Well, yes. Here was another fossil that came out just since I went to work for ICR called Ida. It was even named after Darwinius, which was another imagination-based blunder. Guardian reported on this in 2009. It came out in May of 2009. And it says this: fossil Ida is an extraordinary find, is the missing link in human evolution, which was providing unprecedented insight into our human ancestry on all of these things. Well, look at that fossil. That's a pretty complete fossil. And when these evolutionists were studying the fossil, they said this: the more you look at Ida, the more you can see, as it were, the primate in embryo, said David Attenborough. Now, everybody's familiar with David Attenborough when you watch those Planet Earth movies. That wonderful, soothing voice, which is narrating everything, is David Attenborough. But David Attenborough is looking at this fossil. And as he looks at the fossil, he sees the human primate in embryo. I'm suggesting to you he actually sees that. He sees the human primate in embryo. And not only him, but this discoverer of this fossil, he said this: this one will be pictured in the textbooks for the next 100 years. For the next 100 years. And so he saw all of these things. Now, we were being called at ICR in 2009. This was before, I believe, Dr. Cleary was there. But the phone started ringing, boom, boom, boom. And they said, what do you make of this? What is this? What's your answer to this? And everybody always wants a knee-jerk answer to this. Well, response number 1 was this: wait. These fossils are really short-lived, and they will run their course, and it'll be discovered what it really is. Number 2, if you want to know what we think it is, it looks like a lemur. It looks like a fossil lemur to us on those things. So we waited. And unfortunately, fossil Ida didn't last for the next 100 years. In fact, it didn't even last for the next 100 days. Because by October of 2009, controversial Ida is not a missing link. And after much scientific research, they found that this Ida wasn't even a close relative on that. And they went on to say that Ida is as far removed from the monkey-ape-human ancestry as a primate could possibly be. A paper came out in Nature just a few months later, and these scientists said, it looks like this fossil is a fossil of a lemur. Looks like it's a lemur. Well, how did you go from a fossil of a lemur to seeing the human primate in embryo? Well, I suggest to you, you have a fundamental flaw with your theory. You have to have imaginations. Imaginations can run wild. And when you believe so much in something, when you study it, you actually begin to see exactly what you want to see. And that's why Jane Manshine from the Arizona State University, she's an evolutionist. She's got her doctorate in the history of science. She went on to say this: "We have only to recall the Piltdown adventure to see how easily susceptible researchers can be manipulated into believing that they have actually found just what they have been looking for." And it's easy to do that when your theory isn't tied to reality. It isn't tied to objective things. Ergo, here's a parenthetical thought, this is why the theory of biological design in biology is so powerful. It is tied to real objective things. It's tied to real objective engineering principles. CET makes real objective predictions. I predict sensors. I predict this. I predict the innate logic mechanisms, and on and on and on. It's tied to real things. It's tied to real observations. It isn't imagination-based. Oh, by the way, parenthetical thought number 2. Remember I read to you this morning ICR's previous description of how those cave fish came about, how fish would crash into things and stuff like that? None of that was real. Even ICR could be susceptible to saying things which are not based on reality. Now I know we have these cave fish, and I can tell you they don't crash into anything. They don't scratch up their eyes. They're not based on random mutations. They're not susceptible to additional diseases. All of that was imagination-based stories as well. So we as creationists can offer something that is better now, which is a way of looking at things which is tied to objective reality. And when you have things that are tied to objective reality, you're not going to set yourself up for these kind of evolutionary stories, which are based on pure imagination. So take-home message from Piltdown Man. It was not an anomaly. It's not an anomaly. And what we really need to learn is that the Piltdown Man hoax was the prototype for all the additional blunders that have subsequently followed on. And actually, I deleted a couple just for the sake of time, where people are looking at fossils and they're seeing things, looking at this fossil, seeing something, and what they actually saw was not even there at all. Dr. Clary mentioned this one earlier today, Archaeoraptor, when he was doing his dinosaur talk. So everybody knows that this was a hoax. But the hoax took in a lot of people and was able to take them in because it's imagination-based. Who did it take in? Well, it took none other than National Geographic in. Not some peripheral journal, but National Geographic. National Geographic had on their cover this picture of Archaeoraptor. Now, of course, you go from a fossil to that drawing, and there's a lot of imagination based in that. But you even have more imagination when you look at the title of the article that it was about it, and it was, much to Dr. Clary's delight, Feathers for T-Rex. Feathers for T-Rex. And feathers for T-Rex, a new bird-like fossil, are the missing links in dinosaur evolution. They're the missing links there. And here's a picture of the man who was the discoverer of that Archaeoraptor. And by the way, it was brought over from China. It was sold down in Arizona at an auction, and someone paid a pretty good price for this. And I bet you they thought they had a really, really good find. And even though, just like Piltdown Man, it should have been discovered, I have to say, the person that put this fake fossil together did a pretty good job at it. I mean, you look at that fossil and it's like, whoa, this is an interesting find right here. It's got the fake feathers, it's got the backbone, they seem to be joined together really well, and it does have a mixture of bird-like features and dinosaur features because it was a fake. And National Geographic went on to say this, I didn't read at the bottom there. It says, this mixed of advanced and primitive features. Okay, stop right there. Do you see a little bit of imagination? Imagination is now you're imagining something as an advanced feature, and now you're imagining it's a primitive feature. I could show you articles by evolutionists where they're showing living creatures that supposedly have primitive features on them. So even in their characterization of the features, they're exhibiting a lot of imagination. And they said it is exactly what scientists would expect to find in dinosaurs experimenting with flight. A little bit of imagination there. Then they went on to claim this: it is a true missing link in the complex chain that connects dinosaurs to birds. It seems to capture the paleontological moment when dinosaurs were becoming birds. Do you know where it's capturing the moment? Between their ears. That's the only place that the moment is happening. It's up here in their vivid imaginations, which are highly fertile in what they see. And then they make these definitive pronouncements. Dr. Clary, did you know that we can now say that birds are pteropods just as confidently as we can say humans are mammals? Everything from lunchboxes to museum exhibits will change to reflect this revelation. Wow. Well, just a few years later, this other quote came out in Science News in 2000. Red-faced and downhearted, paleontologists are growing convinced that they have been snookered. I haven't heard snookered since I was a kid, when my dad would tell me, don't get snookered by somebody on these kinds of things. They've been snookered by a bit of fossil fakery from China. The feathered dinosaur specimen that they recently unveiled to much fanfare apparently combines the tail of a dinosaur with the body of a bird, they say. Quote, it's the craziest thing I've ever been involved with in my career. Well, how did this poor man get snookered? Imagination. Vivid imagination and very fertile imagination on all of these kinds of things. So, Archaeoraptor, what do we need to know? Archaeoraptor does not really exist. It was not a real specimen. It was not a real creature. It was a fossil forgery. And the dinosaur to bird assertions, even to this day, and even as Dr. Clary mentioned earlier in his talk today, are nothing but products of vivid imagination. And you can get away with it because your theory is not really tied to reality. Now, in the rest of the book, and if we had a little more time, I would go through other blunders: fake DNA, human appendix, tailbones, and I have a whole section on evolutionary psychology, where you really use incredible imagination, where you study animals, particularly primates. You study apes and you study other animals, and you watch how they behave, and you watch how they do things. And by watching how these animals do things, then you imagine that's the reason why we do what we do and how we act like we act. And it can get you off on the wildest explanations for anything. And it can get you into a lot of trouble. In that book, in the back, I document a whole series of on articles, scientific articles published in scientific journals explaining why men rape women. And the whole explanation is based on the study of primates. And it didn't fit with the narrative of the liberation movement, and those guys got into big trouble. So the whole realm is fraught with these discoveries. And so the title of this message is, why do they happen? Why do they happen? Because of vivid imagination. How do they harm us? Well, they harm us in these areas in terms of evolutionary psychology, but historically, in my opinion, this has been probably the largest evolutionary blunder. Mike Mueller touched on it just very briefly on his talk yesterday evening, but it was the whole eugenics disaster. And I want to just take a little more time to develop it, to explain what are the evolutionary connections? How did you get an evolutionary connection to eugenics? And so, first of all, I have to describe what eugenics was. The reason why is because all the time I was growing up and through high school, I had never even heard of eugenics. I didn't even know what eugenics was. It really wasn't until I became a creationist that I even began to hear what eugenics was. Well, eugenics was a dominating belief. It was a belief that took hold around the beginning of the last century, 1890s, 1900s, and lasted well into the 1930s and 1940s. Eugenics was a belief and a way of looking at humanity, and eugenics was also a practice. So eugenics was a way to look at humans, and eugenics was a practice on how to treat humans. And in terms of treating humans, it was the quest to improve humanity's genetic composition. We want to make humans better. And so eugenicists would selectively breed superior humans, the superior people. Well, who were the superior people? They were the ones who were doing the breeding, of course. And they're people who look just like them. So at the time, the leading eugenicists were all Anglo-Saxon white people. And they were mostly all Anglo-Saxon white men. And they were trying to eliminate the genetic defects in less superior people or inferior people. Well, who were the inferior people? They were the non-Anglo-Saxon people of the world. And the inferior people were also people with any other kind of physical defect. And so they were trying to, on the positive side, do positive eugenics through selective breeding, which means I pick you, and I pick you, and you're going to mate, and you're going to bring about superior people because I see superior traits in you. And on the other hand, I am not going to let you and you have children because you're inferior. So we can do that by selectively sterilizing you. Or if you do happen to get pregnant, we can abort your children. Or if you have these defects and you're older, we can actually euthanize you. So through sterilization, abortion, and euthanasia, they were eliminating the inferiors in the world around them. So how everybody talks about evolution led to this eugenics. Evolution did this, evolution did that. But if I were to ask you, explain to somebody on the street, what's the connection between evolution and eugenics? I mean, you don't find a lot of evolutionists today supporting eugenics, even though Richard Dawkins has recently come out in favor of eugenics again. So what is it? How do you make a link between being a believer in evolution and this whole movement that took place during eugenics? Well, let's go right back to the original sources. Let's read a couple quotes, and I think you'll see it very clearly. There you see a picture of Charles Darwin. And in 1874, in his book, The Descent of Man, he is beginning to explain the links between his beliefs in evolution and eugenics. And he begins, boom, right there. Natural selection. Natural selection as affecting civilized nations. And he said this, I have hitherto only considered the advancement of man from a semi-human condition to that of the modern savage. But some remarks on the action of natural selection on civilized nations may be worth adding. This subject has been ably discussed by Mr. W.R. Gregg and previously by Mr. Wallace and Mr. Galton. Mr. Wallace was the person, the co-inventor of the concept of natural selection with Charles Darwin, and Galton was one of his cousins. So he's going to link his whole concept of natural selection and how he views less civilized races of people. And he goes on to say this, with savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated. What does he mean by eliminated? Those people what? Die. They die. And those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. In other words, in the primitive races, these people just die. But when you become a civilized nation, you soon start to stop this process of elimination. How? Well, we build asylums for the imbecile. the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. And so you begin to see Darwin is arguing that what got humanity from a primitive state to who we are today was natural selection. But suddenly, once we get to be civilized, we start to make interventions which are stopping the course of natural selection. He's going to go on to say this. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. Why do they propagate their kind? Because they're not dead. No one who has attended the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. So now you can see the thinking on all of this. Humanity is starting on a path towards inevitable destruction because we are stopping the course of natural selection. Probably the most articulate proponent of this was a man named Karl Pearson. Karl Pearson was a British mathematician. He was a brilliant mathematician. When I was at Harvard and I was taking my courses in public health, we use formulas to today that test scenarios, and they're called Pearson's tests. So we're still using Pearson's test today based on the fact that he was this mathematician. But Karl Pearson was also an ardent student of Charles Darwin. And he followed Darwin very closely. And he was a strong, ardent believer in Charles Darwin's concept of natural selection. And Pearson said this. He's writing in 1927, and he's writing to a group of medical doctors. He's writing to physicians. And he's saying this. Pearson, as this evolutionary eugenicist, is writing to medical doctors like me. Let me, even at the risk of talking about the familiar, sketch for you the broad outline of Darwin's theory of evolutionary progress. The individual, better fitted to its environment, lived longer than its fellows, had more offspring, and these, inheriting its better fitness, raised the type of the race. This is how we got here. Nevertheless, medical science has to face the fact that the upward progress of man in the past has been largely controlled by stringent Darwinian selection. What will happen if by increased medical skill and by increased state support and private charity, we enable the weaklings to survive and to propagate their kind? I say that the general death rate is selective. Wow. You know what? We as creationists have put together little mathematical models for the creationists to hold the natural selection. It's called Mendel's accountant. And in Mendel's accountant, there is a factor that we factor in called the selection factor. The selection factor. Do you know what the selection factor is in every other area of life, including medicine? The selection factor is called the death rate. And in their view, the selection event is when something dies. That's when the selection event happens. And so he says this, I say the general death rate is selective. So he sees the hand of nature sweeping across things, and when those weaklings die, that's the selection event. They were therefore selected against. They were therefore disfavored. I say that the general death rate is selective. In many ways, medical science has led to a survival of the unfit. He goes on to say, that is, I think, the ever-present fear the scientific mind recognizes. Civilized man has largely destroyed crude natural selection. So the next time someone comes up to you and says, well, evolutionary thinking led to eugenics, you say, wrong. Evolutionary thinking is way too broad. What led to eugenics was natural selection. It's the view of survival of the fittest. That is the link to eugenics. That's the link. He goes on to say, in my mind and in a growing number of other minds, civilization will end unless civilization can find a method for doing for itself what natural selection, those are his capitalizations, not mine, did for man during his ascent, ensuring that he shall breed only from his best. He goes on to say, the study of how it is possible forms the subject matter of what we now term the science of eugenics. There's the link. Man repeating and mimicking crude natural selection was the basis for the, quote, science of eugenics. We have to replace the ruthless action of natural selection, tell me if this isn't an oxymoron, with the reasoned conduct of civilized man. So what's the reasoned conduct of civilized man? You let sick people what? Die. You let imbeciles die. You let all of these people die. And the mark of real civilization is when you let them die. Isn't this, do you get the feeling that this whole world view is seedy? You get the understanding of why we had a World War I, why we had a World War II, why this whole idea of one nation conquering another nation, demonstrating its superior fitness over another nation. All of these things are all fitting together at the same time in terms of this whole science of eugenics. Well, how did it progress? How did it progress? Well, you're thinking, well, it progressed in Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was the leading proponents of this eugenics. No, it didn't. It progresses in the exact same way in which evolutionary theory dominates thinking today. One, according to eugenics, only the smartest, most educated people believed in eugenics. Anybody who opposed eugenics thinking was backwards, was ill-informed, was just a scientific ignoramus and a religious fundamentalist. You know who was really opposing eugenics? It wasn't the Baptist church. It wasn't the Methodist church. It wasn't the Presbyterian church. It was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was the major opponent of eugenics. All the major Protestant denominations, boom, 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 fell right in line with eugenics thinking, just exactly as they have done with evolutionary thinking. So they painted anybody who opposed it as a scientific ignoramus. All of those who were in favor were the well-educated, informed. Number two, all of the best faculty positions at the major universities, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, and every one of them were filled by eugenicists. And anybody who wasn't never felt those positions because they systematically were excluded. Three, they held world conferences on eugenics. They held multiple world conferences. And all of the best speakers were all invited to be eugenicists. And therefore, it gave it a stamp of scientific authority. Four, all the major department heads were eugenicists. Five, they began multiple peer-reviewed scientific journals, all on eugenics, and therefore they could advance all of their thinking under the guise of peer-reviewed science. Does this sound familiar? It sounds exactly how evolutionary theory dominates thinking today, and how they paint anybody who is opposed to it as ill-informed. And because of this, states began to adopt eugenics laws. And they would invite in people to come in to testify before committees and legislatures. And pretty soon, Indiana was writing a eugenics law. And pretty soon, Virginia was writing a eugenics law. After all of the testimony of the most learned men in the country. And those laws, Indiana's law and Virginia's law, those laws were copied almost verbatim by the Nazis to make their law. Wow. It was American law which was incorporated by the Germans for their law. And by 1938, over 33 states had imposed eugenics laws which mandated forced sterilization of people who were considered to be unfit. And yesterday, Mike Mueller and also the other talks that we heard talked about this person here, Carrie Buck. And it became a famous Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell. And Carrie Buck is there on the left, and her mom is there on the right. And Carrie Buck was deemed by the man named Bell to be mentally deficient. And Bell ordered Carrie Buck to be sterilized. The trouble is, Carrie Buck didn't want to be sterilized. And so her case went to the United States Supreme Court. And this is the decision in Buck versus Bell in 1927. Carrie Buck is, quote, the probable potential parent. Now, how would you like to be forcibly sterilized on that definitive reasoning? You're the probable potential. I mean, could you be any less definitive? The probable potential parent of socially inadequate offspring, likewise afflicted, that she may be sexually sterilized without detriment to her general health, and that her welfare and that of society will be promoted by her sterilization, and thereupon make the order. And she was forcibly sterilized because of that. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he wrote the majority opinion, and he said this: it is better for all the world if society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Wow. And so she was sterilized. And not only was Carrie Buck forcibly sterilized, in the United States of America, over 70,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized. Most of them women, but a lot of young boys had mandatory vasectomies performed on them as well, and they were forcibly sterilized. Over 8,000 people in Virginia alone. Virginia alone. Here's some pictures that you don't really see that much. And it's all from this Darwinian worldview there that you see. Look at that, up in the upper right-hand side. Those are young boys in elementary school, stripped down to the waist so their teacher can perform a eugenics evaluation on them to see which one of them are the fittest. You could take your kids in the lower right-hand picture to state fairs, just like your tomatoes or your pecan pie. And you could enter them into contests to see which one brought home the blue ribbon for being the most eugenically superior. You could go to the eugenics building. That's a picture from a state fair at the university in Indiana. And you could get a eugenics certificate where it's usually the wife. She got her potential husband examined by a doctor, and the doctor would give her a certificate that, boom, he's just been examined and he's certified grade A prime beef and fit to be a good husband for her and future welfare. Well, how long did this mandatory sterilization continue? Well, the last 4 sterilizations happened in Alabama in 1973. It continued all the way up until the 1973 there. And there was 3 girls, the Ralph sisters, who were considered to be mentally deficient. Mary Alice, Minnie, and Katie. Katie was the oldest. She was 17, and she had a forced IUD put into her, but her 2 younger sisters, who were the ages of 15 and 13. 15 and 13-year-old girls were forcibly sterilized. It's amazing. By the way, Carrie Buck, who was forcibly sterilized because she was mentally deficient, she was later found out not to be mentally deficient at all. She wasn't that smart, but she wasn't that smart because she had this other problem. She was poor. And she had grown up poor and she didn't have a good education. And so her poor education was determined to be that she was mentally deficient and she was forcibly sterilized. So she suffered from poorness in there. And then if you look up on the screen there, you'll see the Eugenics Quarterly. Eugenics Quarterly, 1966, 1967, 1968, suddenly changed over to a book called Social Biology, but it continued on with the same thinking to that time. So why do these blunders happen? They happen because of incredible imagination. Are they harmful to people? Are they harmful to society? You better believe they do. And this gentleman here, who was a major advocate for evolutionary teaching being taught in medical school, he even recognized this, that in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, most applications were medical Darwinism that focused on the welfare of the species. In connection with eugenics, this led to moral and social disaster. I'd say a social disaster counts as an evolutionary blunder on that. And so the next time someone asks you or you're discussing it, what's the linkage between evolutionary theory and eugenics? Well, it makes sense. Survival of the fittest, only letting the fittest breed, getting rid of the weakest. Death is the selection event. And Christianity and selectionist thinking are completely and totally incompatible. One is a worldview that is driven by death, and the other is a worldview that sees death as a curse and death as an enemy. And death is something that should be eliminated. And as we mentioned last night, that's what it is. So there isn't really a eugenics evolution linkage. There is a strong eugenics selection linkage. So what we need to know, it's belief in natural selection that was really the fuel for eugenics. Eugenics was the ability for people to try to mimic what they called as crude or raw natural selection. And natural selection is not God's eugenics program. Why do I put that in? It's because I hate to say creationists have accommodated with natural selection, and you will even find writing to this day where they'll say, even though natural selection is fueled by death, it shows God's good care for his creation by eliminating the weakest from society and getting those genes out of the gene pool. That isn't God's eugenics program. When a child who dies of a genetic defect before they reach reproductive age, that is not a gift to the rest of us. That's a tragedy. That's what it is. It's not a gift. And so natural selection isn't God's eugenics program. If you're interested in this and you want to know more about it, the book is in the back. It'll give you much more information on that. So what do we need to know? Imagination is integral to evolutionary theory. It's these fertile, vivid, wild imaginations which are driving all of these blunders. And it's because they're believing in evidence that they don't see. But the blunders are not benign. The blunders are harmful to society. So that's the take-home message for today. It does matter what you think. Thank you very much.